My name's Lawrence Schaaf, and I'm giving your talk this evening. And this evening's talk is about the Windsor Beauties, which I've entitled The Power of Beauty in Restoration England. And I wanted to start by setting the scene prior to looking at the paintings we see here now at Hampton Court. I wanted to give you a feel for what it was like in Restoration England. So let's start with a picture of the person who became king, Charles II. It's 1660. The king was Charles I was beheaded 11 years ago. There was a civil war, which is now over. There was the Commonwealth period for the last 11 years, and that was a fairly bleak period in a way. No entertainment, theatres closed, even entertainment celebrations at Christmas were banned. But there were a lot of new ideas discussed, including equality of the sexes. And then suddenly, in 1660, the monarch, the son of Charles I, Charles II, was invited back, and everything changed. It changed from monochrome to technicolor. His court was one of beauty, power, and passion. Everything had changed overnight. And those new freedoms, which suddenly were unleashed on Puritan England, were brought about a lot of repercussions in society. Women could appear on stage for the first time, write books. Margaret Cavendish became the first woman scientist but it was a totally male-dominated society. So women could occupy positions of power and authority through being a member of the nobility, for instance, but it was very hierarchical. Beauty, though, which is my theme for today, was associated with virtue. If you were beautiful outside, you must be beautiful inside. Also, when Charles II came to the throne, he brought with him, because he'd been living on the continent and living for part of his time in Paris, he brought the conventions of the Parisian court with him to London. And in that court, the mistresses of the king, or mistresses in general, were openly recognized and had power. Everybody knew who they were, and they were openly acknowledged by the king, and therefore they became a route to power, because essentially all power focused on the king, and anyone with access to the king had access to power. And so because mistresses were acknowledged, they in turn had power through their access to the king. And so the fact that they were publicly acknowledged made them not only important members of the court, but they also became well known in society, because engravings were produced of them and circulated. They were well known, and people that wanted something done, who wanted access to the king, had another route to the king through the king's mistresses. So catching the king's eye, if you were a woman who wanted to go down that route, and it was a route to wealth and titles as well as power, then you needed to catch the king's eye, or maybe the king's brother James's eye. Of course, a lot of people didn't like this. They disregarded the court as depraved, the detestable rule of kings. And we see Charles here in his finery. All of the crown jewels were destroyed by Cromwell, melted down and sold, broken up. So when Charles came to the throne, he had them remade at a cost of over £12,000. And to give you an idea how much that was, it would have bought 3 warships. as well as the 12,000, he spent another £18,000 on 2 tons of gold altarpieces and banqueting plate. So he he wasn't backward in exerting his power and spending money. But to switch to a different aspect of society, this is a coffee shop. Coffee shops actually started in the Commonwealth period. 1655, I think, was the first one to open. But within 20 years, there was something like 3,000 in the country. So coffee shops, women couldn't go into a coffee shop, but we know from records of Sunfire, the insurance company, that something like 10% of businesses in London were owned by women. Now, a woman, typically a woman would inherit, because their husband would die and they would inherit the business. So it's been speculated that in this picture we're looking at now, the woman behind the counter is the owner. We don't know whether she was or she wasn't, but she could have been. But women couldn't enter the coffee shop. They could serve. Coffee shops were a place where you'd pay a penny and you got unlimited coffee all day. It was like the coffee you can get in America now. It was a perpetual refill for one payment. And there was a lot of discussion and about scandal. They read scandal sheets, or these broadsheets. You can see them reading and talking about what's going on. And of course, what was going on at court with the Merry Monarch, Charles II, was what a lot of people talked about. Interestingly, at this time, there was a broadsheet was circulated, which was unique. It was the first one that actually had what we call news. The rest, they never had news. It was opinion. It was like a blog. It was people's opinion about what was going on. And the person who wrote that first daily newspaper was a woman, Elizabeth Mallet, and it was the Daily Courant, published in 1702. The first one to actually have news in it. Her offices were actually near the eastern end of Fleet Street. But I get off the subject. There were, incidentally, a lot of women. In most towns, half the population were single women, and in the countryside, mostly men, because so many men had been killed in the Civil War. But also the jobs for women, housekeeping and servants and so on, were in the towns, and the jobs for men were in the countryside. So there was a surfeit of women. It was this time when the phrase old maid was first used for the first time. But let's talk about, I said there were opportunities for women. Let's talk about some famous women, just to give you an idea of what those opportunities were. This smartly dressed woman, Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, was the first woman to publish scientific papers and also to write what we would call, I suppose, feminist books. She was also the first woman to write, in fact, I think she might have been the first person to write a work of science fiction called The Blazing World. A very interesting work. It was actually published in 1666, the year of the Great Fire. But it's not about the Great Fire. It's about how a woman leaves her country. I'll try and abbreviate it, goes to the North Pole, finds a route to another world, and that world is populated with animals. It's a bit like Animal Farm, but run by a woman. And then she puts together an army and brings all of these animals back, who then she takes over the country that she came from. But she didn't write mostly fiction. She wrote mostly scientific papers, and she was the first person to present, first woman to present a scientific paper at the Royal Society. She was invited there, and she knew all the scientists of the day. She published many papers. She wrote 21 books. She published many, only wrote one book on science fiction, but wrote many books on natural philosophy. Her husband, the Duke of Newcastle, was someone that she was in love with. They were in love with each other, and she wrote a book about their relationship where she argues that all marriages should be marriages of equals, and you should only marry for love. She was outspoken. She was regarded as an eccentric, partly in her clothing. It was remarked she had an unusual sense of fashion. Women did dress a bit like this at the time, as we'll see in a moment, but she was regarded as eccentric. She was extravagant. She was flirtatious. These are descriptions taken from the time. And her speech was full of, and this might surprise you, oaths and obscenities. Let's move on. Another very famous woman at the time, and unusually an artist, Mary Beale. This is a self-portrait, but she painted in the style of Peter Lely. Most of the other paintings I'm going to be showing you were by Peter Lely, who I'll talk about in a moment. The Mary Beale painted in the same style as Peter Lely, was very, very competent. At one stage, actually, when she was younger, she lived in Walton. She married, and her husband was a clerk, but come the plague, and then they moved out of London. And when they came back, he worked as her to grind her pigments and to do the accounts, and she became a full-time artist. And in her peak year, she made £429. We know precisely how much she earned because the accounts were very well kept. That year she carried out 83 commissions, which meant, I calculated, on average it was 5 guineas a painting, whereas Peter Lely it varied depending on the size of the painting, but you could spend £100 on a Peter Lely painting. So significantly cheaper, and recommended by Peter. Peter Lely would say to people who couldn't afford him, go and see Mary Beale. And in fact, she took premises near to him in Pall Mall. But moving on, Aphra Behn, you might have heard of, first woman playwright. She was very popular as a playwright. She wrote and staged 19 plays. Her life, she said, was dedicated to pleasure and poetry. Her works were known for their bawdiness, and she was praised for her masculine style. That was a term of praise in those days, masculine. She had no interest in women's rights, or in fact anyone else's rights except for her own. And then the final career path I wanted to talk about, this is called Portrait of an Unknown Woman, but we now think, by comparing it with engravings we have of Margaret Hughes, that this is a portrait of Margaret Hughes, or Peg Hughes as she was called, the first woman actress, or the first well-known woman actress. Now, prior to this period, at the time of Shakespeare, the beginning of the 17th century, women's roles were played by men, as you probably know. But you might not know that when Charles II came to the throne, he was concerned that men dressing as women encouraged and led to what he called unnatural vice backstage. And as a result, he decreed that all female roles in future must be played by women. And that, of course, gave a great opportunity for women, a new career opportunity for women. And Margaret Hughes played Desdemona in Othello, lots of famous roles. Samuel Pepys wrote about a mighty pretty woman, and seems, but is not, modest. Now, you might have noticed that one of her breasts is bare, and this was something that, not a convention is the wrong word, this in a painting was symbolic, but what it symbolized varied depending on the context of the painting. And I can give you an example here, because there's two conflicting symbolisms going on in this painting. One is she's got her hand on a jar. Can you see her left hand is on a golden jar? And that usually refers to the reformed biblical sinner Mary Magdalene. So on the one hand, she's representing herself possibly as Mary Magdalene. And on the other hand, she is quietening an attentive spaniel, and the spaniel was identified with the Stewart royal family. So it's indicating that she's a royal mistress or something similar. So that there's, let's move on because we'll see more examples later. This is Peter Lely. And before I go on, some of you might pronounce the name Lely, Lely, or Lely, and you can say whatever you like. And in fact, I've listened to talks by world leading experts, and they all pronounce the name differently, even at the same event. American art historians tend to say Lely. The reason I say Lely is because of the derivation. His name was actually Peter van der Faes. Faes, F-A-E-S, was a Dutch name. He had Dutch parents, although he was born in Germany. He adopted the name Lely because he thought that English people wouldn't know how to pronounce farce because it looks like face. So he adopted the name from a heraldic lily that was painted on the side of his father's house. And the Dutch for lily is Lely. It's actually spelt differently. It's L-E-L-I-E, but pronounced Lely. I think he probably spelt it L-E-L-Y because he thought it was more acceptable in Britain. So that's why I say Lely, because it's Dutch for lily, which is where his invented name came from. Anyway, moving on. More importantly, he arrived in London in 1641, and that was important because it was the year Anthony van Dyck died, and so he had the opportunity and he did replace him as court painter. In fact, it was about the time when a number of well-known artists of the period either died or left London. Mark Gerrits had died a few years before, Paul van Sommer, Daniel Meitens, Cornelius Johnson, and William Dodson, the court painter, died a few years later. So Lely was able to take their place and was in great demand. And in fact, this, of course, when he came to London, was before Charles I was executed, before the Civil War. He survived all the way through it. In fact, he became a painter. He painted Oliver Cromwell. He painted famous generals. So he survived. He was non-political. And as a good painter, he just survived all the way through it, came out the other end of the interregnum and became painter to Charles II and was in enormous demand. When he first came to the country, and I'll explain more about that later, when he first came to the country, he quickly established a position of dominance in the art world. Samuel Pepys described him as a mighty proud man and full of state. And he did live well. And he was, I think, the first artist to acquire an impressive art collection. And that's what he's indicating here. This portrait, this self-portrait, is he's showing himself as a gentleman, and a gentleman who has an impressive art collection signified by this figure, this statuette that he's holding here. He didn't, of course, when he first came, he was trained in Holland. He didn't start off painting portraits. In fact, this is one of an early work, which you might be familiar with because it's at Dulwich Picture Gallery by him. And so this is the sort of painting that was more popular on the continent. But this was Puritan England, and this was commissioned. We don't know by whom, but it was commissioned in England. We imagine it was kept behind a curtain or in a room, and it was commissioned by a private patron. It's not, I mean, obviously here it shows naked and semi-naked women as objects of the male gaze, but it also at the time was justified at the time by the classical reference. Now you might wonder what classical reference. Well, there's three, I suppose. There's this classical sort of statue up the top here. There's the title of the painting, Nymphs by a Fountain, and there's also, and people would know this work, there was this work by Van Dyck, an artist who was revered at the time and who Sir Peter Lely copied or followed in the style of, I should say. And the people would remember this pose. This painting is now in the Royal Collection, and the poses he adopted follow on from that reference. But quickly he moved away from that and started to, this is by him as well, of Charles II, and start to paint portraits. And that's what made the money in this country. Everybody wanted portraits painted. The other thing, I've got a few points I wanted to cover before I get down to, and I wanted to leave half an hour for the Windsor Beauties. So going through this quickly, only one of the Windsor Beauties, some people think they're all mistresses of Charles II. Only one is a mistress of Charles II. The others are beauties of court. Some of them are mistresses of other people, but some aren't. The famous mistresses of Charles II are, first of all, Barbara Villiers, who is one of the Windsor Beauties. So I'll talk more about her later. Then perhaps the most famous is Nell Gwyn. Now, I know it doesn't say Nell Gwyn. It says portrait of a young woman and child as Venus and Cupid. The fact that it's titled Venus justifies her being naked because she's Venus in those days. The reason we know it's Nell Gwyn is we have engravings of Nell Gwyn, and the face is the same. And then finally, the mistress, and by the way, I don't want to make out that Charles only had 3 mistresses. At the latest count, he had something like 14, and he had some 11, some people say 12 acknowledged children, and some say as many as 17 illegitimate children by 9 mistresses. I was just about to say that Louise de Kerouac was the, or Kerouac was the mistress, the French mistress who replaced Barbara Villiers. And you can probably see from all of that, that as to why he was called Old Rowley, which was the name of one of his stud horses. In fact, when he got older, he had less time for mistresses and he spent a lot more time sailing and fishing, but he did have a lot of mistresses. Let's move on. And also, I didn't want to give the impression when I come on to the Windsor Beauties that they were the only beauties at court. The Windsor Beauties were chosen, and I'll tell you in a moment how they were chosen. There were many other women at court recognized as leading beauties of the court. And remember, being a beauty was something significant and important at court. Again, you might wonder why a breast is exposed, and the answer is that she's holding a rose, and the rose is symbol of the goddess Venus, and therefore she represents Venus, and therefore she's allowed to be semi-naked because she's Venus. The goddess Venus. It also might signal sexual availability in some cases, but in this case, we know this painting was commissioned by the Earl of Oxford, and she at the time was mistress to the Earl of Oxford. It was commissioned by him, and then a few years later, she became his wife. So another point is some mistresses that were publicly known to be mistresses married the person they were mistress of, and they later had 5 children. So just to repeat briefly, beauty was synonymous with virtue and purity, and a beautiful body was equated with a beautiful and innocent mind. So these images show purity and innocence. Incidentally, it's this painting that you might well remember from, well, it was a long time ago now, so maybe you won't, 2001. It was the painting that was banned on the London Underground because the National Gallery wanted to use it to as an exhibition poster, but they wouldn't allow it to be shown on London Underground. So there's still prudish people around. This is the person who commissioned the Windsor Beauties. This is Anne Hyde. She was the wife of James, who at the time was Duke of York. So she is Duchess of York. She died before he became king. She was someone who from, well, her father was Lord Chancellor, but she wasn't nobility. And so it caused a scandal when she married James because she was of low birth. And she was regarded by Samuel Pepys, for example, regarded her as a plain woman. I think it's partly because he didn't think the Duke of York should have married a commoner, even though she was pregnant at the time. She gave birth, I think 2 or 3 months after they'd married. And the other thing that people disapproved of is that it seems they were deeply in love because they showed public affection. He would kiss her and they would lean and hold hands and lean towards each other in public, which was considered completely improper behavior. So I think it's just an expression of their affection. And of course, it's Anne Hyde, who was the mother of Mary, later Queen Mary II, and of Anne, later Queen Anne. And she commissioned the paintings we're about to see, but we don't know on what basis she commissioned them, except that she was selecting some of the beauties. Not all of the ones she selected, as we'll see, were friends of hers. She didn't like some of them, as we'll see, but they were the beauties, or some of the beauties of court. The other point I wanted to make is that we're about to look at a number of paintings look very similar. And so let me first talk about the process of producing a painting. Peter Lely had a very large studio with very skillful journeymen and apprentices. What he would do, Lely would draw a sketch of the face and would take an hour and a half, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, and maybe once or 2 sittings, maybe 3 sittings, depending how much time the person had. And aristocrats tended not to like to sit for long. Then he would hand the sketches he'd done to the studio, who would paint the rest. They'd paint the face, the body, the drapery behind, the clothing, and the background. And then he would come along and improve and finish off the face, maybe sometimes the skin, sometimes the hands, but principally the face. So it was painted by a team based on a number of set patterns. And that's why these two look very similar. They are using a very similar pattern. They didn't wear these. This is not the fashionable clothing of the period. It's something that Lely invented or made fashionable for a painting, I think because it was probably easier to paint than what they normally wore, which, and I think I've got, oh, before I do, just a point on, you've probably already noticed that these two women are not the same woman. They've got different names. And over the years, it's been confused it's confused art historians as to who they are. Mary Baggot, Countess of Falmouth, is one of the Windsor Beauties, number 6, and she has over the years been erroneously named Elizabeth, Countess of Falmouth, and in some books you'll still find that. And Frances Brooke is also number 9 in the series of Windsor Beauties, and she had a sister called Margaret Brooke, Lady Denim, who's number 3 in the series, and sometimes historians have confused her sister Margaret Brooke with Frances Brooke. But don't worry about all these names. I just wanted to show you really the face. This is a portrait by John Michael Wright, who, if you remember, painted the first painting I showed you of Charles II in his finery. I just wanted to show you the face, because what Peter Lely did is and it might not look to us today, but he glamorized them. And what counted as glamour in those days is, first of all, a long neck, exposed shoulders, and the décolletage, the chest exposed, and that is the what they wore, as I'll show you in a moment. But then on the face, heavily lidded eyes, sometimes called almond eyes, was also fashionable. Very well-defined eyebrows, as you can see here in the Lely paintings. A full mouth, but not too small or too big, and this flowing hair in ringlets. So you'll see a lot of those features in all the Lely works. Now, some people say, Pepys said of the Windsor Beauties, not like, they didn't look like them, but Lely was known for producing a good likeness. So it's difficult to get to the bottom of that. And I tried here by finding a picture, not by John Michael Wright, actually after John Michael Wright, of the same woman, Mary Baggot, so that you could compare the two, but we don't know what she really looked like. So it's all a bit of a mystery, but the fact that a lot of these portraits look very similar indicates that he was glamorizing them by giving them the features that were considered beautiful at the time. I said I'd just briefly show you the dresses of the period. This is a modern woman in a dress that's been made of the period. They had these skirts split at the front, showing the underskirt or petticoat. They had at this time, the 1660s, these balloon sleeves that were slit, cut through, and you can see the Queen here wearing something similar. And nearly everyone wore these off the shoulder and low cut pieces, but the bodice was sharply defined, as you can probably better see here in this modern dress, as very different from what Peter Lely painted. So they didn't wear these clothes when he drew them. They were invented by the studio, who were used to painting this sort of drapery. They only Lely just did the portrait, the head. So let's quickly run down the corridor. It's just outside the Cumberland Art Gallery, as you can see, and I'll take you down. This first beauty, we're getting on to the Windsor Beauties now, is Elizabeth, Countess of Northumberland. That's Elizabeth Risley. Next is Henrietta, Countess of Rochester. Then Margaret, Lady Denim, Margaret Brooke, we just saw. Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland. Elizabeth Hamilton, Countess de Gramont. Mary Baggot, who we've just seen, Countess of Falmouth. Anne, Countess of Sunderland, followed by Jane Middleton, Frances Brooke, the one that looks very similar, Lady Whitmore, and then Frances Stewart. So let's just look at the corridor back towards the Queen's staircase and move on to the first of the Windsor Beauties. This is Elizabeth Risley, which is the way I pronounce it. Some people say Roseley, some Risley, Countess of Northumberland. And she was, I call her the hidden beauty. Oh, and I should say that these titles I've given them are purely my invention, because the names are so hard to remember, because many of these women had up to 6 names. They had the name they were born with, and some of them married 1, 2, or 3 people with different names, and each one had different titles, and so you can call them by the title or the name. So I've just simplified it to the hidden beauty. Why do I call her that? Because her husband, who's Jocelyn Percy, Earl of Northumberland, a name you might have heard of if you've been to Syon House, one of his properties, and he was worried that they married when she was still a teenager. In fact, he was going to marry her sister, Audrey, but Audrey died, and so he chose the next sister along, Elizabeth, who he married instead. And she was known for her beauty. Samuel Pepys described her as a beautiful lady indeed. He was frequently ill, which delayed their marriage, but they did get married. They had 2 children, and then he wanted to go on the grand tour, but he didn't want to leave her behind because he saw that Charles II had his eye on her. So he took her to Paris and hid her in Paris, so to speak, and went on the grand tour on his own, and then caught a fever and died in Turin, leaving her in Paris. She went back. She was a rich widow, chatelaine of Syon House, and then later married the Duke of Montagu, who was English ambassador to Paris. So she died a very wealthy woman and was never a mistress. Why do I call her the poisoner? I think it's a bit of a calumny. But I'll explain why. Henrietta Boyle, Countess of Rochester, well, could have committed murder. She was very strong-minded, ruthless, and acquisitive. She was the daughter of a very well-known, very well-known and rich Irish family. And but she was married. Her husband, who was later made Earl of Rochester, was Lawrence Hyde. Recognize the name Hyde? Yes, he was the brother of Anne Hyde. So Anne Hyde, not the Queen yet. Sorry, she didn't become Queen. No, but the wife of James, who was to become king. So a very powerful figure, the brother of the king. She was married. So she was his sister-in-law. And another of the women, in fact, the next woman I'm going to be talking about, the poisoned one, was the mistress of James, the husband of Anne Hyde. I mean, I said they were deeply in love. He still had mistresses. And I'll tell you more about the poisoning with the next painting, but Henrietta Boyle was one of those that was accused of murdering her by the diarist John Aubrey. Without evidence, he says that Lady Denim was poisoned by the hand of the Countess of Rochester. So let's look at Lady Denim. Margaret Brooke, or Lady Denim, she married Sir John Denham, who was a poet. In fact, he was described as tall, thin, and stork-like poet and gambler. And shortly after they married, she seeking advancement and power in the court, became the very public mistress of James. Now, I think the person most likely to have murdered her is her husband, who went, this cuckoldry sent him mad for a while, Sir John Denim. And she had been the Duke of York's mistress. In fact, it's also worth a couple of quotes here from the period. The first one is interesting. This is, and I'll read it all, it's from Pepys's diary. The Duke of York is wholly given up to his new mistress, my Lady Denim, going at noonday with all his gentlemen to visit her in Scotland Yard. She declaring that she will not be his mistress as Mrs. Price to go up and down the privy stairs, but will be publicly owned, and so she is. In other words, going up and down the privy stairs meant that Mrs. Price, no one knew she was a mistress. She went secretly, but it was, you didn't get power from no one knowing you were a mistress. You got power from everyone knowing you were the mistress of a powerful person. So she wanted to be owned publicly, and so she was. However, it ended tragically. About a year later, she had a drink of chocolate, of cocoa, and as soon as she drank it, she believed she'd been poisoned and insisted that if she died that night, there should be an autopsy the next day. She did die. There was an autopsy. We don't know whether the outcome was swayed by somebody powerful, but there was no trace of poison found in her body, but the public still believed that she was poisoned, and the public believed it was her husband, Sir John Denham, who murdered her with a cup of cocoa. And as they say, the earliest example of death by chocolate. There was a little poem on Andrew Marvell wrote about the murder. What frosts to fruit, what arsenic to the rat, what to fair Denham, mortal chocolate. Now, this is the most powerful woman you've seen, because she wasn't born powerful, but she was, for a long period, the #1 mistress of Charles II, the only mistress of Charles II in the Windsor Beauties. Barbara Villiers, often called Countess of Castlemaine, but she was also Duchess of Cleveland. She was called at the time the #1 beauty, but she was also called the curse of the nation, and she was also called the uncrowned queen. She had 6 children by him. 1 died, but the other 5 were ennobled. So her children became dukes and duchesses, and she was she was more influential, I think, on the king than his wife, Catherine of Braganza. And she became extremely wealthy. She got titles, as I've told you, Duchess of Cleveland. She incidentally was given Nonsuch Palace by the king and made Baroness Nonsuch, amongst other titles. Now the palace, Nonsuch Palace, was built by, I wish it still remained, but it was in Nonsuch Park, and it was built by Henry VIII as nonpareil. No such palace this wonderful exists in the whole world. And the first thing she did as owner of the palace is pull it down. She had it demolished and sold all the materials. That was typical of Barbara Villiers. She was strong-minded, very quick to anger, and as I said, a foul temper. But there's a little story about her. One day, her and the other ladies of the court were in the park when they saw some scaffolding collapse and injure a child, and none of the other ladies went to help, but she ran forward to help the child. So maybe she got the foul temper was directed more at the other members of the court, so she could get what she wanted because she had the ear of the king. John Evelyn described her as the curse of the nation. Peter Lely, by the way, was enamored of her. He painted her at least 10 times and said that it was beyond the compass of art to give this lady her due as to her sweetness and exquisite beauty. And in fact, the attributes of beauty that I've described, the eyes, the mouth, the eyebrows, were taken from her. They were her. She was the epitome of beauty in the court. So in a sense, all the other mistresses were trying to look like her. She's dressed here, by the way, as Minerva, and she's holding a shield with a Gorgon's head on it, as I think to contrast against her beauty, the vilest ugliness and the most exquisite beauty together. And another sort of background point is that she had many descendants. She had, all of her children had different titles, and so descended from her is, for example, Lady Diana Spencer, the Mitford sisters, Bertrand Russell, Sir Anthony Eden. The list goes on and on. And I said Peter Lely painted many pictures of her. This is another one of her, and in this one, it's even more extreme in its symbolism. She is dressed here as the Virgin Mary, with one of her illegitimate children is Jesus. But let's move on down to the Joker. And I call her the Joker because she carried out so many, she loved practical jokes. And there's a lot of examples of people in the court that she'd played games on and misled. She there were two women who loved the same French marquis who were going to a ball, and she got them to dress up in absurd costumes because she told them it's what he loved. So jokes of that sort. She was also known as La Belle Hamilton. All of the women I'm showing you, or nearly all of them, were seen as leading beauties of the court and often had names like La Belle Hamilton. And the other ladies at court copied these beauties. And I've mentioned, particularly to those that were listening to me before I actually started this talk, I was talking about blushing. And this woman, Mary Baggot, who we saw just now, Countess of Falmouth, was given to blushing. She blushed all the time, and it was I think it was Pepys who said there was an involuntary blush almost continually upon her cheek without having anything to blush for, and this was a very powerful symbol at the time of her virtue. Women went to great lengths to artificially rouge their cheeks to look, and I think I've got a close-up. He's that is, Lely has pointed. You can see the red in her cheeks. I assume that's a natural blush because she had red. I don't know whether she was blushing. She had red cheeks all the time, as naturally. She was a humble origins, but because of her beauty and particularly her blushing, she was much sought after. She was described as a trophy wife, and there were rumours that she was a mistress of James, the Duke of York, and it's rumours that he fell in love with her and said that when Anne Hyde died, he would marry her. But instead, she married the Earl of Dorset, Charles Sackville. Then there's the flatterer. Now, I said earlier that all of these paintings were commissioned by Anne Hyde, and I assume paid for by Anne Hyde. Anne Digby, or her married name Anne Spencer, Countess of Sunderland, Anne Hyde didn't like. She described her in a letter she wrote to her sister, Princess Mary of Orange, as flattering, dissembling, false woman, but she is so fawning and endearing in her way that she would deceive anybody at first, and it's not possible to find out all her ways in a little time. And she goes on and on in this letter. One would take her for a saint, but she is not. She's the workingest villain that is on the face of the earth, and the subtlest, she wrote. So she didn't like her a lot, and but she is one of the Windsor Beauties, and she was commissioned. Incidentally, this painting, you will have noticed, is a studio copy. So we think that Peter Lely didn't have any hand in it. It was completely painted by the studio. And there is another portrait of Anne Spencer that in one of, I've forgotten where, Althorpe, I think, where the original Lely painting is. But it was this copy that ended up in the Windsor Beauty series. So I call her the flatterer, because that's what she did to get her way. And when she took on, she became Catholic to try and get on better with Charles II, but that when James became king and was more overtly Catholic, and that led to the invasion and James fleeing the country, you would think that she would not be in anybody's good books. She fled the country, but managed to come back. And I suppose Anne Hyde would say that she wheedled her way into the affections of then Princess Anne, and later became Queen Anne's lady in waiting. So she survived all the way through. That's Robert Spencer, the Earl of Sunderland, whose painting is at Knowle. I think that's why I was showing that. You might wonder why I've called her the smelly one. Well, let's start off with, well, it comes from Samuel Pepys, but I'm not actually sure it's true. Pepys wrote it in his diary, but he also described her as silly and sentimental, which probably was true. She thought of herself as a great wit, but other people wrote, and Pepys wrote, she was considered by most people as boring and tiresome. And about her body, there was a continued sour base smell that is very offensive. That's from Pepys's diary. But he heard it, I assume he knew her himself, but he heard it as well from Elizabeth Pierce, another court beauty and wife of a friend of his, who came to dinner one day to Pepys's house and told her the story. Now, we know that Elizabeth Pierce hated Mrs. Middleton, Jane Needham, and she told him that there was a continued sour base smell about her body, especially if she be a little hot. So we don't know whether Pepys was just recording what she'd told him or something that he knew himself. His wife, Pepys's wife, incidentally, didn't like Elizabeth Pierce because he thought that Pepys wanted to have an affair with her. His wife was jealous. And Elizabeth Pierce was one, I haven't got a picture of her, but she was one of the great beauties of the court. And it was said that she still looked only 20 after she had had her 19th child. the quiet one, Frances Brooke. She was described at the time, you couldn't tell it from this Lely painting, as having an ugly nose. She married twice, she had no affairs, and she was, I call her the quiet one because although she was well known at court, she had no affairs. She married Sir Thomas Whitmore, and she later, I think he died fighting in the Civil War, and I think she left the court. A lot of women came to the court regularly, but she married, her second marriage, she left London and lived for the rest of her life in the countryside, and that's why I call her the quiet one. Unfortunately, she died in her 40s. And this is one of the great beauties. I think I've said that about a lot of them, but this is La Belle Stewart, Frances Teresa Stewart, Duchess of Richmond. And a lot of people said the prettiest beauty at court, right at the end of the corridor at Hampton Court. A woman who could spurn Charles II and get away with it. She's shown here, by the way, as the chaste virgin huntress Diana. And she was certainly chased by Charles II, but she managed to put him off. But he selected her face to go on a medal he was producing to represent Britannia. And that face and that image of Britannia was transferred to our coins and remained on our coins up until decimalisation, but was transferred to the 50p coin until 2008. So up until 2008, you were looking at La Belle Stewart, Frances Stewart, described as by Samuel Pepys as the prettiest girl in the world and the best fitted of any to adorn a court. The greatest beauty I ever saw, I think, in my life. She was described, however, her beauty was, somebody said at the time, her beauty was only equaled by her childish silliness. So I don't think she was the greatest brain in the world, but the greatest beauty. There is a wax effigy of her in Westminster Abbey. So that takes us to the end of the talk.